So my talk today, it focuses on two case studies. Both of them come from the archives in Kazan, of Kazanский учебный округ, and they concern they both focus on the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. And one of them is a case of a file I found of teachers' appeals, жалобы. They were dismissed from their positions for various reasons. It was just maybe 10 cases, and the article I've written is, I just used 4 of them. They're very different. Tolstoy papka. They appealed, and each of these cases went through several instances, and usually lasting a year or so. And we don't always know the results, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is really the discourse and the process that I want to talk about. So I want to talk about that, and I want to also tell you about a teacher's summer course in Viatka in 1900, which brought together something like 400 teachers, but the interesting thing, before this teacher's course, they were sent a course or enquete with 30 questions on it, asking them about their lives and about their experiences teaching. So I want to use both of those to combine to talk about something which is a lot larger, which is местное управление in general, and this question of whether there was a crisis in местное управление at the end of the century, and if so, why? What were the institutional, ideological aspects of that? So, what I wanted to do at the beginning was, if you're not a specialist in the history of education, then you might not know that at the end of the 19th century, kind of like the perestroika era and the end of the 20th century, education was treated as an extremely important issue for the country as a whole. Because, as you know, Russia was undergoing a kind of very rapid modernization, and entering into the 20th century was becoming destabilized, and many people were concerned about Russia's status, not only its political stability, but its status as a great power, and its survival. And in the 1890s, the Russian periodical press began to discuss very intently the necessity for moving the country towards всеобщее обучение. In the 1890s, no one wanted it to be compulsory, because particularly liberals among the Russian educated class were saying, we already have too many compulsory things in our country. But they wanted to make education accessible for everybody. And then in the early 20th century, the government signed on to this, and in 1908 began to pour millions of rubles into achieving and made considerable progress. But the most important thing for me right now is to say that everyone believed that expanding education was vital for the survival of the country. Conservatives were arguing in terms of social control, but also in terms of making factory workers more productive through schooling. The military was concerned with that as well, and the church. Everyone agreed finally that this was really important. And for that reason, equally important began the question of who's going to be our teachers. And at the turn of the century, it was often pointed out that the Prussian school teacher was the person who was responsible for the victory at Sedan in the war against France by training patriotic and disciplined citizens, and also argued that the French school teacher was responsible for providing a Republican loyalties in the country as well. The question with Russia was very different because, everyone had a different vision for who the teacher should be. But the main thing I'm trying to establish is that at this time, given the fact that Russia perceived itself to be in a crisis and that one of the ways out of the crisis was through education, but for transforming the country, everyone recognized that the selection of the teacher was a very, very important issue. And control over what was taught was very important. No one rejected that, and from the liberal and the radical socialist side, they had similar ambitions, was somehow to emancipate the country through bringing up critically thinking individuals. So just what was perceived as the radical importance of the agenda is what's really important for this particular argument that I want to make. So I'll begin first with the teacher's summer courses. Hopefully by the end of this talk then you'll understand why I think it was bigger than these really humble topics. The summer courses in Russia took place in several gubernia after a long period in which the government had just completely categorically prohibited them taking place. They were organized by the Zemstva, and the one I'm talking about was in Vyatka. The Zemstva took the initiative. It was working with two progressive officials, one by the name of Anastasyev and another Kravtsev. They actually had been trained by Lenin's father in Simbirsk, and so there was a kind of interesting. They both were quite liberal and progressive in their views. They invited among the teachers was the well-known pedagogue Tikhomirov and the textbook author Goldenberg, who do the mathematical textbooks for the elementary schools. And as I mentioned before, in advance of the course, which took place in June 1900, teachers were sent this long questionnaire asking them about their backgrounds, length of time working as a teacher, family situation. Am I speaking too fast? Are we okay? Okay. Textbooks used, and methods of instruction, as well as the problems they encountered while teaching. The responses to the more than 35 questions that were asked, they fill up 4 volumes held in the state archives in Kirov, which is, of course, Vyatka then. And they provide all kinds of insights into the daily life of the school. From several of the questions, it's clear that teachers are unhappy with the amount of time they spent in the curriculum devoted to the religious catechism, as well as to the old orthography. They value explanatory readings. They like the progressive textbooks that were available to them. Many of them were actually forbidden. They've been supposedly removed from the classroom, but inspectors would say, well, we don't have any other textbooks, so how can we take them? It's kind of like this, and so they remained in use. But, let's see, they value explanatory readings, et cetera, and generally they strongly suggest their answers. From their answers, they become convinced that what we would call today a child-centered approach is far better than the more traditional rote methods which official pedagogy was arguing for. I'll provide only one example from the questionnaire, which I found especially meaningful. And the question was, what methods of discipline do you apply with difficult children? In America, that's a very political question, the term, difficult question, difficult children, problem children. You have to be very careful the word you use. But that was a sense of that. And the interesting thing is, overwhelmingly, they responded that they rejected harsh methods, including телесное наказание, corporal punishment. That was out, no way. And they also often added, which was really interesting, that when and if children were failing to learn or behaving badly, it was not the children's fault. It was their fault as teachers, that they were doing something wrong. And I looked at that and said, boy, that's really interesting because, for example, in England at the end of the 19th century, corporal punishment was very widely used in this democratic society, right? And I don't know how many of you know the children's writer, Roald Dahl. British. Most people don't know his name, but many of you would know Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the movie, for example. He wrote many, many books. My daughters grew up on them. They're really great children's literature. But he also wrote a memoir about his childhood called Boy. And if you read it, it's really horrific. The abusive treatment of children in the British schools, in the elementary schools for common children. But here in Russia, you have teachers saying, no, we can't do that. It's our fault if we don't maintain discipline. So what does that tell us? It doesn't prove, actually, that corporal punishment had been eliminated everywhere in the schools. I don't think that's the case at all. Because teachers were often dealing with huge numbers of pupils in a very crowded and difficult conditions, and they may have often acted against their best intentions, even if they thought that was a good idea. It doesn't even prove that all teachers agreed with that philosophy of how to teach children and maintain order. What it does show is that the pedagogy, the discourse of a humane, child-centered education had reached really deeply into the countryside. And everyone would agree that Vyatka, where I've spent a lot of the last few years, was the glush. I mean, it was a deep countryside. And it's really interesting that these teachers coming from the deep countryside have somehow also absorbed this pedagogy, which is very different from what the official, the Fiziosny, if you want to call it, the official discourse was. So my argument is that by the turn of the century, despite an abundance of laws and regulations trying to control teachers, ideologically their training had largely slipped out of the hands of the autocracy. The autocracy itself was divided over this question, over many issues about education. I'll come back to that. But you're familiar with the struggle between the Orthodox Church, Ministry of Education, both over where school funding should go, to parish schools or to secular schools, which should be, in fact, whether curriculum should be largely secular or primarily religion. But at the provincial and the district level, the records also show that many inspectors and directors were working together with Zemstva educators to promote pragmatically progressive agendas. All right, now let's turn for a little bit of a longer discussion to the teachers' complaints. Before I do that, I have to mention one institution which has been given little attention by historians, namely the Училищный Совет, that were created in Russia with the Great Reforms. The archives, at least in Kazansky Учебный Okrug, are very scattered and not very abundant, but the ones I found were very, very interesting for the purposes. These Училищный Совет were set up at both the provincial and the district levels. I call them school boards. That's what were created during the Great Reforms as a result of a broad debate that had taken place over school reform in general during the first period of glasnost in the 1850s, etc. And the idea for the school boards was to provide society the opportunity to have some input in education and to be, but this idea of societal input, which was in the first drafts of the educational reform, were discarded after 1862 when the government began to move in a more conservative direction. But the school boards were retained. And the reason for that was not because they wanted societal input, but because the other ministries, the Ведомства, were very suspicious that the Ministry of Education, посвящен, was trying to establish a full monopoly over schooling. And so they said, we like these school boards because then we can have input, we can have representatives. And so for reasons that had to do with interministerial kind of rivalries, the school boards gained a place in the school system. The school boards were required to have 2 representatives from the governor's office, or in other words, the MVD, or the Ministry of Внутренних, from the church, the so-called nablюдатель, who was the church parish school inspectors within the diocese, 2 representatives from the Zemstva, the marshal of the nobility, the председатель дворянства, and as well as the chair of the Zemsky Uprava, right? So all of those are there, and then later on the Zemsky Nachalnik was added in provinces where you had him, and a doctor as well, who usually was represented. And of course the school inspector at the UES level, from the Minister посвящен, and at the provincial level, the provincial director of schools. I assume you know, because we'll go through this, that with the Ministry of Education, what you had were popicitoli, who were the curators of the large educational regions, many provinces, and then you had the director, who was at the gubernia level, and then at the district level were the inspector. And it's also important to note here that many of the inspectors at the turn of the century, they were officials, right, of the Ministry of Education, but their salaries were paid by the Zemstva. Because the Zemstva, and this is a very important thing to see, because obviously if your salary is being paid from one source, you're going to pay a lot of attention to the opinions of that institution, right? So anthropologists, so the key thing is the marshal of the nobility was to serve as the chair, ex officio, of the school board at both levels. The school boards were to approve all hirings, firings, and transfers of teachers recommended by the Zemstva or initiated by the local inspector. All three of these, the Zemstva, the Ministry of Education, and the school boards had a say in when teachers should be hired, fired, etc. And that provided all kinds of grounds for conflict, of course. And I should mention too, I say hired, fired, and transferred. And as you will see, with all the conflicts that developed with teachers, the usual resolution was to fire them, and then they would appeal and would go through the process. And instead of firing them, because that was too complicated with the protocol, they would transfer them to another district, which is, when you think about the consequences of that, it's just you're sending your troublemakers out to another place to cause more trouble. It was in the system. All right, so anyway, anthropologists would call, they call schools, but also school boards, what they call it loosely coupled systems. Anyone help me with the translation of that? Loosely coupled. Coupling is like when you bring two wagons of a train together, they couple, right? You know, so, and loosely coupled means they're not very tightly coupled, right? And the idea there, a loosely coupled system is one that it's very hard to change because you have so many stakeholders, you have so many people involved in it that it's very, very hard to create school reforms. Parents, teachers, you know, et cetera, officials. So let me say a few words about the poor teachers who had been dismissed from their employment. And the question is, were they really victims of abusive treatment, as they claimed, and sometimes very convincingly, or not? We don't really know the truth of the cases. That was really frustrating. What is more important is the discourse as well as the process. Usually it went through several instancia, and at the end the director wrote the curator. And the curator would write Napoleon right on the sides, and usually in handwriting I couldn't understand at all what to do about this case. I had to usually get help on that because they were just scribbled on the side. Sometimes when I figured it out, I loved it, like the director was saying about the inspector, he's lying. And I'd say, oh, that's an interesting comment on that. So, but those are the most interesting things. So the first case in the article that I've been writing concerns a male teacher by the name of Alexander Lazarov, who was at Arsk, which is a small city right outside Kazan. And he'd been dismissed from his employment because he was accused of stealing money from his assistant teachers, but also from the dormitory fund where children were staying. And he was also for running a for-profit furniture workshop from which he had himself earned enough money to buy a large musabba of about 8,000 rubles out in the countryside. And an average teacher salary at that time was about 360 rubles a year. So he had some explaining to do where that came from. He, of course, denied the charges, but he was eventually forced to transfer elsewhere, which is, again, a common solution. 2 other cases involve women teachers, both accused of neglecting their classes, being absent for long spells, but then also, and interestingly, fighting, in one case, literally, physically, with their colleagues, it having to do with a husband and a boyfriend. I can leave it as that kind of the story. One of them, Maria Lasanova, was accused of having wild parties at the school and of, quote, sleeping around, and having multiple sexual relationships with men. She was interrogated, and this is her description of the interrogation. They took me, this is the Marshal of Nobility and the inspector of the schools and the doctor, aside to an empty room, locked the door, and began to grill me, to ask questions. And she was claiming she was very sick, and the doctor was saying, you don't have a fever, you're not sick, you don't have coronavirus or whatever. So, and she writes, they wouldn't allow me to have witnesses. They refused to discuss my record as a whole and asked me if I, quote, had an acquaintance with the other teacher, Muchin, and whether he paid nocturnal visits to me. And also, did the German teacher, as well as the telegraph operator, also come around at nighttime? But weren't these all gentlemen, family men, continued the chair of the nobility? I mean, the chair, the Marshal nobility. So, quote, so you like to hang around with young men. I denied these accusations and became quite hysterical. The inspector, Miloslavsky, looked on quite impassively as I repeated, I did not socialize. But we have in evidence insisted, this horrible day will remain with me for the rest of my life. And it's really hard not to read the women's accounts without really seeing real gender issues here, or being really mistreated, there's no question. But still, in response, the director of schools, who was trying to figure this case out from the evidence and was responsible for sorting out this matter, he wrote the regional curator. When he wrote the regional curator, he painted this portrait of twisted personal sexual relationships, during which the ties between the teacher Danilova and her assistant Volnova, who had apparently been very close friends while studying at the gymnasium, had these ties had disintegrated. According to reliable testimony, according to the director, the teacher, Muchin, who rumor has it was actually the father of Danilov's children, not her husband, but had directed his amorous regards towards Volnova, the assistant teacher who had been her friend. This was one of the causes why there was a public fight between these two teachers at the school. And then the director continues, there certainly were parties there, drunken revelries, dancing, and those in attendance were very disreputable types. Or he wrote Ludi, Durnovatona, does that sound right? Ludi Durnovatona. Including the accordion player from the traktir, the barker from the circus, the telegraph operator, the feldsher, all bachelors fond of drink. Volnova, the assistant teacher, insists that these gatherings took place not only with Danilova's agreement, but her urging, that she had met these people, that Danilova had arranged trysts for her at Volkova's apartment with Muchin, since she couldn't receive him at her own apartment without making her jealous husband very angry, of course. So both women stood their ground, insisted that they were innocent, and if they had missed some school days, there was some illness. The charges, they resisted the charges, appealed their dismissals, they cited abuse or treatment by the powerful men who were investigating the cases. And one of them arguing that it was actually really about her husband, who happened to be the Zemsky Nachalnik, who was engaged in a personal rivalry with the Marshal of the Nobility for their positions, and who happened to be the chair of the school board, of course. In the other case, Danilova accused the person making the charges against her of actually wanting to put his own niece in that teaching position, because this was quite a well-regarded school. All of these cases involve several appeals and reviews lasting over a year, and ultimately both of these teachers were offered transfers to other schools. And there's no way to really resolve the truth of these cases. That's not so important. Finally, the last case involved a recently arrived school inspector, Nikolai Nikiforov. And this was in Kozmo-Demyansk district and also in Kazan. His case was different, and it was 10 years later, in 1907, when it began. It was explicitly political, involving his efforts to remove a group of teachers, all of whom were under suspicion for belonging to the teachers' union, Учительский союз, and affiliated with the SR party in that region. I tend to believe he was right. I think they were, but it's because there's a lot of secondary evidence that would suggest that. But Nikiforov found his efforts prevented both by the local Zemstva and the school board, and he even lacked the support of the provincial director of schools. And he was, as well as the nadudatel, the church inspector, who defended these teachers, which included several men and women also. So it was a pretty large group. So he had very little luck. What's significant in all these cases is that when looking at them, there's absolutely no way to predict who would support any given teacher and who would favor his or her removal. The Zemsky Nachalnik, the marshal of the nobility, chair of the local Zemstva Uprava, the official doctor on the school board, the inspector, director, they all took different sides in different cases. And there's no way to predict that there was any particular, even when within the Ministry of Education, in several cases, in particular Lazarov, the director accused his own inspector under him of cooperating, or the word I use is colluding, which is with the local Zemstva Uprav to hide the evidence of corruption. In another case, Danilova, the director, accused his inspector of violating protocol by allowing the Zemstva to make decisions about hiring teachers or even to send out messages to teachers about curriculum. So Zemstvas were supposed to limit their activities in education after 1864 in what they call хозяйственность, and not be able to talk about teaching. But of course, they violated this. And the fact that they paid or supplemented the salaries of inspectors had an influence on them. In several cases, the teachers, and remember that they had very little status in this position. They were not government employees like the teachers in the secondary schools who wore, if you read Chekhov, who of course had a uniform, they were very different status. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took advantage of this, trying to undermine opposition to them by unifying the teachers' unions of secondary school and primary school teachers, because he knew that Bolsheviks knew they wouldn't get along and there would not be effective opposition, because most teachers opposed the Bolsheviks. So in several cases, the teachers were actually related to local members of the nobility and supported by them. And often we find local officials, all from the nobility, fighting with each other. So I just, from the records on the Danilov case, in her case we witnessed two influential nobles, the martial nobility, land captain, pitted against each other, the Zemstva Uprava collaborating with the inspector, the provincial school board overturning a decision of the district level school board, the land captain successfully appealing to the school board the decision of the inspector in 1892 to demote the teacher, who happened to be the land captain's wife, before finally in 1895 the school director, with the approval of his superior, the curator, firing or demoting both teachers involved in this mess, and ultimately the curator reprimanding the inspector for failing to follow set procedures, and saying something like, "At the border, at the bazaar," was his kind of comment about the whole situation. As for the school inspector, Nikiforov, we find the school board divided, the Zemstva attacking him and accusing him of negligence, never visiting the schools he was supposed to visit, writing up reports without collecting any evidence. And as I said before, even the local parish church inspector voted against him. Here, his personality was clearly important. He claimed he was just following orders to root out revolutionaries, but the director above him concluded that he lacked the personal skills to get along with anybody. The term he used was "on the umeet mladitsis ludmich," I think that was it. Is that correct? Yeah. All right, so what do we make out of these stories? It took me a long time to figure out what I thought we should make out of them. because it was really confusing, actually. And I think it's tempting as if you just read these accounts of local competition for place, petty feuds, moralny neustойчивость is what I think the term we might use, moral turpitude. It's easy to agree with the assessment that one person wrote on these files that said, this is just очевидные следы обывательской, деревенской обидчивости. I had spent a lot of time trying to translate that into English, but so a story, in other words, of human shortcomings that isn't limited in time or place to Russia, just simply the kind of subjective personal issues and patronage networks, etc. And I think there's a grain of truth to that conclusion, but there is more to it than that. So this is what I would like to argue, and some of you may be familiar with the great Soviet era historian, institutional historian, Yeroshkin. He's pointed out that by the end of the century, the provincial nobility dominated all key positions in local governance, ranging from the martial nobility, the chairs of the Zemsky wards, the Zemsky Nachalniki, the provincial Politmeister, and the Pristav. Likewise, they were well situated to exert considerable control over schooling, and namely teachers. Again, given the rising tensions in the country and the importance to both state and society, which had placed upon education as a key to the future, we would expect the nobility and the bureaucracy working closely together to make sure that what was going on in the school fit the agenda that they subscribed to. But there's some consensus among historians that in fact the relations between the provincial nobility and the bureaucracy in the countryside had deteriorated in the half-century since the Great Reforms. At the same time, Western historian Alfred Weber, he coined a phrase to describe what was going on with society in the second half of the 19th century in Russia. The argument used to be whether or not the nobility were in decline, Soslovia was giving way to the rise of classes, and Al Weber said it wasn't quite the same way. Classes were rising, but Soslovia remained very, very important. And what actually happened was that, and the professions added another kind of identity. And so what happened was what was created was a sedimentary society where people had multiple identities, multiple affiliations. And my argument is that that really, along with these subjective issues, kind of prevented, in many ways, the nobility for acting, being very conscious of their common interest, even though you had this revival of nobility corporatism. So, so finally, there's some evidence also, and I just read a very interesting article while I was here, for what he called a razrucha v головах among local bureaucrats that who were increasingly demoralized and disoriented by ministerial rivalries above them, conflicting circulars that were emanating from their superiors, and the erratic and unpredictable behavior of the emperor himself. All of these considerations created an atmosphere at the local level that allowed personal rivalries and feuds, as well as patronage networks, to continue to dominate even during a time of national crisis. Instead of convincing elites to put these aside in the interest of stability and consensus in this realm, which was designated as vital to the country's survival. So once again, I return to the point I made at the beginning. Everyone believed that school teacher and education were key to Russia's future. The fact that local authorities, school boards, Zemstra, MVD, Ministry of Education could not put aside these personal issues, social patronage networks, to find agreement, even about these such seemingly unpolitical matters, is indicative of a much larger problem in local governments at the turn of the century. That's my argument. I don't know if it's right or not, so you can tell me. Thank you.
Что-нибудь известно о том, о составе слушателей этих летних курсов? Кто именно на них приехал? Насколько состав этих людей по бэкграунду репрезентативен для учительство в целом. Потому что возникает подозрение, что туда ехали наиболее прогрессивные, наиболее продвинутые, наиболее заинтересованные люди, а такие костные, консервативные, патриархальные оставались где-то там в глубинке и не приезжали.
I can't answer that question right now. What we do, you do know how long teachers have been, you know their family situation, you know how long they were teaching, you know what their salaries were, but it's really hard to get at that, the process. And I found some stuff in the archive that was, and there were actually articles in Vyatsky Gubenski Ведомости about the conference, etc., that gave me some sense of the thing. But I think that a lot of them were taking advantage of the fact that someone was paying their way to go into the city from the deep countryside and spend 2 weeks in Vyatka, which was the big city. That was what was really motivating more than anything, one way or another, progressive or not. Yeah. What was interesting actually was too, I don't know how to put this, but when I read the paper, it was something very interesting because the paper described how when Tikhomirov, are you familiar with him? He was a very well-known educator. He was the editor of a pedagogical journal, and he was right up there with Vakhtidov and a few others who you might have heard of in your courses or something. But they wrote with kind of adulation about the arrival of this great pedagogue to our little town. And then when he left, this is a newspaper saying the sun didn't show up again for days after he left. It had disappeared. It really sounded like the 1930s almost, with this kind of praising, excessive praise. But other than that, no, I can't really, I don't think there's anything that I could find in the archives that would get answered. I'll continue to look up. It's a good question.
But I have a question about not your report, but about your abstract. How in abstract you said that you used as a frame neo-institutionalism.
Right.
Neo-institutionalism as a frame or as a method for your issue. But how do you understand?
Fair enough. Yeah. I didn't really follow through.
In historical studies, but not economy, not in historical.
That's a very good question, and I don't have a very good answer for it right now. I think I was thinking along those lines, but it was the institutional discourse that I was following within the school boards, within the ministry, and seeing how it conflicted. But that's not a very good answer for you. I think it was, and I was trying to sort out in these documents the language that was being used by the inspectors and others who were contributing to the file, and trying to see how they adjusted that language to the expectations of the institutions they were writing to. It doesn't come through here, and this is something I am working on. The neo-institutionalism, the way I understand it, aside from the discourse side of it, is when it comes to education, in the West, as here, education history used to be limited primarily to reading laws and regulations, and then assuming that they were representative of the reality of the ground. And then I think when, at least in the West, when education history became very multidisciplinary, anthropology, etc., and the linguistic term had a very large impact, people began to think that laws and regulations are just completely irrelevant to what goes on in schools. And of course, people really began to focus on what used to be called the black box of schooling. You know, in Russian, the term black box, does that mean anything?
Yes.
Черный
Yes, yeah. I think it's the same as in English.
So, in other words, you know what goes in,
Yes.
and you know what comes out, but you don't know what's inside it, right? And that was the hardest thing people were trying to focus on for a generation. That's why you have Bourdieu and you have all the others who were talking about reproduction in school, things of that sort. But recently, some historians have come back and say, well, and I think that's happening in other fields too, where institutions are reappearing in discussions about material reality. And I don't know what the story is here on that course, but for example, in my history department at Indiana University for a long time, I think it was, this is an old person speaking, but I think it was impossible to see that institutions existed or that material reality actually existed. And I think you're saying with anthropology too today, turn away from symbolic representations. There's a lot of talk now about, I was at a conference about infrastructure, right? Anthropological infrastructure. And that to me is, I said, well, what do you, I was on a panel in San Francisco saying, what do they mean by infrastructure? And really, it was a very wide definition of it that connected with material realities and brought them back into a discussion, trying to combine it with discourse and language study, etc.
Хорошо известно, что в мусульманской школе в те же годы проходят водные процессы реформирования.
Где?
В мусульманской школе, в том же районе, джадиды и прочие движения. Какие-нибудь, обычно это исследуется совершенно по отдельности, то, что происходит в истории мусульманских обществ, и то, что происходит в истории, собственно, русского большинства. Какие-нибудь пересечения, контакты, ссылки друг на друга, что-нибудь вам попадалось? Абсолютно отдельно.
Well, I know several of the people who do, some very good, some of them are my students actually. There is some discussion, for example, one recent dissertation which talked about schools in Azerbaijan and in Tbilisi and creating teachers training there and how they were connected with the Uchebny Okrug and how these were filtered through the intelligentsia there and created cultural spaces, etc. Yeah, so there is this kind of thing. And Mustafa Tuna?
Yeah, sure, I know.
Okay, yeah. But the connection, no, the only connection, of course, I've studied when you go to Vatka or Samara, and of course you see minority schools, right? There's a couple of really good books about it, actually. I was really, just from the point of view where I come from the inspectors and all of that, I was really interested when I read one inspector's report who had to list how many schools there were in the district. And he talked about 120 schools. And he said, no, I'm wrong. It's actually 150 schools. Because I hadn't noticed the 30 Muslim schools. And then he had to answer how long were these Muslim schools in existence. And he said 15 years. So in 15 years, he only noticed after 15 years of existence that they actually were there. And then wrote a quick report on it, which is kind of suspicious. Yeah, I mean, that's an area where there's a lot more that can be done. Of course, Kazansky Uchebny Okrug was the biggest, I think the biggest, St. Petersburg, and I think it was actually bigger than, and it was a huge area. And in Vatka, the number of Muslim schools was really limited to one area. Instead, you had the Vachak and the Chinese, those schools were different. And they also had this big issue of villages where you had three different languages and finding teachers who actually could communicate or teach in those environments was almost impossible.
Actually, my question also refers to what Olga was asking about. So I was wondering how you were choosing those places, because you mentioned Vyatka and you mentioned Kazan. Would you say that there's a difference between the учебные округа. So when it comes to turning down corporal punishment, would you say that it differed?
I don't know. I mean, the problem with that, when you have tens of thousands of schools and several districts, there has to be a lot more. I think there's no question that.
The question is obviously yes,
yeah.
But would you?
Yeah, but I think.
Are you interested in tracing back differences?
I think it's quite possible. In some ways, Vyatka was exceptional because of both Krasov and Anastasia, who were very unusual. Anastasia became a national figure. I've got a beautiful photo of him. He published in the Journal Министерства народного просвещения for many years. And again, these were the byproducts of Lenin's father. You know, when you read about his childhood, what a wonderful, dedicated proficient he was. But it's true, actually. And he clearly had an influence regionally here. And I don't know whether that made it exceptional. There's a big debate about inspectors that I've been involved in, because in 1914, the educational journalist Zvyagintsov published a book in which it's 150 pages describing terrible, terrible inspectors. They were ignorant, they were abusive, they usually came from the military without any training in pedagogy. But actually, the service records that I went through don't support that. I mean, it was clear there were abusive inspectors. There are in any bureaucracy, there are people who violate it, right? But what the quality of them was clearly going up at the turn of the century, and there were many who were pragmatic reformers, and so that's very hard. But on a Russian-wide scale, it's really hard. Why did I choose Kazan? Because the archive was there, and because the сотрудница Lalia, God, she was wonderful, absolutely fluent in English, obviously, and Tatar and Russian, and very welcoming. And you'd be sitting in the archive, and instead of trying to take the documents away from you to put them away, she'd be suggesting other things. She'd be saying, "Have you looked at this?" Everyone who worked there really loved her, but she was fired and sent somewhere else, and they hired a chinovnik to take over the archive, and now the archive's closed, and it's all being digitalized, but there's no access to it all, so it's a starry story. But I think it was really, a lot of Western historians went to work in Kazan because the archive was so rich and was so open in the 1990s. Judith Burbank and Willard Sunderland and Mustafa Tundar and many others went there. So it was circumstantial rather than intellectual. Okay. Yes?
Спасибо за интересную лекцию.
I'm sorry, I have to come to the question.
Мой вопрос будет касаться летних курсов в Вятке и 30 вопросов, которые задавали учителя. Да? Вот в этих вопросах, точнее в ответах, учителя указывали какую-то аффилиацию, то есть являлись они сторонниками какой-то методической школы, которая была распространена в то время, например, я стою на позиции холстовства, либо я следую за Ушинским, либо еще что-то.
Нет, никогда. Никогда.
А какие конкретно вопросы были? Вот эти 30 вопросов, как вы преподаете, какая у вас методика?
As far as I can tell, it was Anastasia, again, who was this productive educator, inspector, working with Zemstva educators, who were, many of them were bывшие ссыльные, that had a large number of people who were, had been exiled first in Siberia and allowed to come back to work there. And they had Vyatka was known, Zemstva, as being one of the most progressive, but not oppositionist Zemstvas in the country. And partly because of its, this one also, the chair of the Zemstva Prava was a fellow named Batuyev, who was assassinated by a madman in 1894, but he was famous across the country for setting up libraries in the Shkol University, so he was very active there. But no, there was nothing in there asking specifically. All I could tell was from the fact that they would mention textbooks they liked. And if you knew who wrote the textbooks, then you knew exactly what the code was there, you know. Bulgakov, Vatsilev, Tikhamirov, all of those were known as progressive educators. But who, I think the question still comes, they were coming out of the countryside, and sometimes their educations themselves, usually 2/3 of them were women, and many of them had been trained at ecclesiastical, I've forgotten all the Russian there.
Семинарий.
Pardon?
Семинарий.
Eparchian, so they had.
Церковно-приходские? Церковно-приходские, нет?
No. Well, they could also go from Prihaskar or Ushilasa, but then they also had to have a year of pedagogical training somewhere. That's the way it would work. The Zemstva set up a lot of women's secondary schools with the idea of providing a future generation of teachers. That's where many of them came from.
То есть можно сказать, что в это время большая часть учителей уже имели профессиональное образование. Что это были не просто грамотные люди, которые преподавали, а люди профессионально-педагогически образованные.
Mostly, but not exclusively. Usually, if you had finished any kind of secondary education, then you could teach it in the Talmud level.
But you didn't get any pedagogical
Not necessarily.
in the secondary school, not at all.
Those who went to Zemstva secondary schools the last 2 years would be pedagogical kind of training. So I didn't get any. The thing I'm most concerned about was whether I can make a convincing case that these обыкновенные следы деревенской, or was it обывательской обидчивость, whether they can be interpreted as something more than that. And I gave this talk in the United States, and I did not convince the audience. So you're being very polite about it.
Just to contribute a little bit of controversy.
A little bit of what?
A tiny bit of controversy.
Yes.
Contradiction. I've been working with the minutes of Teachers Congress of 1912 in St. Petersburg, I guess.
Yeah. Those are wonderful sources.
Yes, with minutes of speeches held there, of letters and lectures and everything. And quite a few teachers uttered extreme concern and sometimes even fury about the conditions prevailing in the school institutions they worked at. Very harsh conditions, low pay, excessive control and abusive control from above, frustration, tiring working conditions. Well, actually, across the board, the school produces nervous people. Школа производит нервных людей because they lack time for proofreading and grading all the heaps of students' works and so on and so on. So most of what I've been going through was very, very critical, very sort of oppositional to the existing schooling system in Russia. So my impression was that the school teachers, including or perhaps even particularly female ones, but very, very dissatisfied with the way the schooling system in general was built and functioning in Russia at that time.
Well,
Did you have the same impression from your sources?
First of all, I think you really have to separate secondary school teachers from primary school. They were really different worlds. They were completely different worlds. And of course, all the secondary school teachers were men. So that makes a very different thing. And the other thing is that schools are all, if you look at the discourse, schools are always in crisis. Everywhere. Right? I mean, they're always in crisis. And I mean, that's the description, the discourse. And sometimes they really are. But I've also made the argument that Russia was not nearly as backwards as the discourse at the end of the century was. People, if you read the correspondence of Russia's ruling elite, the turn of the century, they're worried that Russia is going to become another India or China. In other words, lose its sovereignty completely if we don't educate everybody and do other things. But also, when they cite how far behind Russia is from the West, for example, you can compare the Russian Empire with the British Empire. Not just Britain, but British Empire, like include India. But then you get really interesting statistics about enrollments and literacy, et cetera, et cetera. But also, you get discussions like there's discussions about the school hygiene and school buildings that describe the terrible condition of Russian schools. And then they compare with the West, but what they use from the West, sometimes from going and traveling there, sometimes from taking templates, the blueprints for what a really good school should be in the West, and without investigating what the average conditions really were. And if you go out, you can still find, I have lots of pictures of them, if you compare the school buildings in Nebraska, United States, that's in the 1890s, with the Zemstva schools, the buildings, the Zemstva schools are much better constructed in terms of hygiene, in terms of space, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that there wasn't a lag or backwards, but this trope of backwardness sometimes really got excessive in discussing what was going on. And you often compared what the ideal in the West was with the realities in Russia. And that created this kind of sense. But still, and there were, I read so many descriptions too. I've read maybe 2,000 or more inspectors' reports, if not more than that, from the 1890s to the turn of the, and even from there, you know clearly what's going on. What was it? One inspector usually had up to about 90 schools to visit every year, and you can imagine the roads. Imagine going through Vyatka, which is almost twice the size of Ireland, I think. I mean, and you had 11 inspectors. They were visiting 100 schools every year, but it was a day travel between every school, you know. And they would show up for 2 hours and sit there. And the teacher was usually a young woman who was terrified, and he might give he might be voyenny, like he was retired military, and he'd give her a sample lesson, and then he'd give her all kinds of criticisms and put them in the school journal, right? Which then would cause her all kinds of troubles for the next time around and leave. And I was so happy when I found a couple of school journals where this had happened, and the women talked back to him and then wrote in the journal in response to his criticism, this inspector's an idiot. And that goes, I don't know where it went from there, but it wasn't going to help her at all in her career. But they were very, very stressful, tense situations, and also that with the exams when the inspectors showed up. And that's another question. We also, if you read the periodical press, and again, there were something between 100 and 150 journals, and all the Tolstoy journals, also the 20th century, were writing constantly about education. But if schools were a failure, what could you possibly learn in 2 to 3 years in a country school like that? And what everyone wrote about was that the results, whatever they were very short term, in 10 years after they'd been in school, they'd forgotten how to read and write, right? Because 2 or 3 years, what can you learn? And 1911 Zemstva Congress, which was a huge source too of information, I read the comments about also on Kieter, like what do students learn and what do they know in 10 years? And actually what they were forgetting was proper Russian, but they were essentially, they'd learned how to communicate even though it wasn't proper grammar and it wasn't proper spelling, and with the old orthography, which completely killed them. Krasov, the one I'm talking about, he did retention studies. He went into villages and he looked at students, pupils who had been in the rural school for 10 years before and tested their math, their ability to count, numeracy, and their basic reading skills. Like, could they read a letter that they wrote to someone in the city? And could they write a letter that the person in the city could understand? And basically, he said, yeah. Again, the spelling was terrible. It was a disaster. That's another question that where the discourse was of failure, but the outcomes were maybe not quite really as bad as that. So.
Just a small question there. From your report, I failed to understand what kind of schools. From your report, I failed to understand what kind of schools are we talking about. Are we talking about just Zemstvo schools, or are we talking about all schools in Kazansky? When you,
no, these were Zemstvo schools because the parish schools were not under the authority of the school boards. They went through separate school boards.
Then given your thesis about this progressive pedagogical philosophy, etc., so don't you think that when we talk about just Zemstvo schools, we refer to just one part of Russian school education, right?
Probably 80%.
So what happened? So what happened in церковно-приходские schools, for instance, right? What about corporal punishment, etc., etc.? Because if we, I don't know, simplify your thesis, it will be just like, I don't know. It was not as bad in Russia as Soviet historiography used to describe, right?
Right.
But if we want to debate with Soviet historiography, in this case, we should focus not only on Zemstvo schools, but on all schools that happened that were in Russia.
Yeah, and I've written about it actually in my first book. I wrote quite a bit about parish schools too, and they actually followed a pretty similar. By the turn of the century, their curriculum was modeled after the 1897 Ministry of Education curriculum. The teachers were poorer, they were more poorly paid, they were losing ground to the Zemstvos, the religion was taught in the Zemstvo schools by the local priest or the deacon would come there, so there was an interrelationship between the two. But no, obviously, and the question about Muslim schools is obviously really important to do to fill in this as well. But these are getting a grasp of the 150,000 teachers and the thousands and thousands of schools that were Zemstvo is itself a kind of lifetime of work. I mean, I think. And, but for a full picture, yeah, I agree. But the Zemstvo schools were the dominant schools. The secular schools were clearly the dominant schools after 1900s. There's no question about that. The church parish schools were fading. The Zemstvo schools too, it's important to know that there were two different types. And one of them was actually not technically Zemstvo, were they called ministerial schools that were set up in 1875. And they were two-class, offering 6 years of, and these were the actually, if I had time, I would have said, these were where like Lazarus taught, and he didn't want to give that school up. But he had to give it up, and he was sent somewhere else, where he was sent down, in other words, to teach in an ordinary 3 years Zemstvo school, where the salary was much less and the conditions. So those are really the big difference, where this ministerial, Obrazovy Shkola, and this is Pat of the Border, which usually had 2 teachers, 6 years. I also found out, a lot of the teachers, they wrote about their isolation in the countryside. Single women, they were very vulnerable to the authorities. They were also very vulnerable to the villagers because the villagers recognized that they had no power. They didn't have a uniform. They didn't have any power, and they were sitting out there, barishne in the school. And they felt often very, very isolated and insecure about their situations. But, okay. Thank you all for... So I can say that all of my esteemed Russian colleagues agreed with me totally that these were representative cases that tell you about the failure of местное управление for Russia, right? No? And what I really wanted to show was that if they couldn't agree about hiring and firing our teachers, what could they agree upon? And this really showed that there was no unity among the elite in the countryside, and that this whole notion of a crisis of the местного управления. Some historians say that local government has always been the Achilles heel of autocratic rule, both in the 19th.
I think it's not a surprise, just your thesis about the crisis in local governance. I think it's not a surprise for Russian historians.
Not a surprise.
It's not a surprise.
No, everyone knows
it's my personal opinion.
Everyone, we know there was a crisis, but the question is exactly what was the nature of this crisis. And I think it was institutional, ideological, and that's what historians have trouble exactly describing. The fact that there was either no vertical or there was too much vertical. I mean, that's about. But I don't think American historians would disagree either, that this is not a new story. That's what you were saying, though, right? That this is nothing new. So what? As one of my colleagues said, so what? I had to translate that. New story, right? Is that the correct translation of it?
Yeah.
New story.
Well, I based my conclusion just on my knowledge about the Russian Empire. Maybe there are some specialists in the Russian education at the start of the 20th century who disagree with me, right? I don't know. So,
what were your conclusions?
No. My conclusion is that nothing new, right, in the crisis of the local governance in Russia. So it's my just personal opinion. Maybe there are specialists in the Russian education who will disagree with me and say that these conclusions can contribute to the historiography of education, etc., etc.
Right. And again, I think everyone agreed there was a problem. Stolypin agreed, right? He wanted to fix it. And there was a 1897. Duranova organized a conference about local government. In 1902, Vita organized a conference about the failures and there was one more. There was a third one in 1904. And then Stolypin tried to introduce this, of course, this radical reform. People often think about the failure of Stolypin's land reforms. That's what they focus on, right? But I think maybe whether they failed or not, the question of local governments is maybe more important. But I never claimed that I was открывал America, the Russian historian. Well, Oleg likes to object to my papers, and I enjoy it very much. So I appreciate it. Thank you.